It was a busy afternoon at the bustling shopping plaza on the east side of town. Officer Daniel Harris, a middle-aged cop with a reputation for being decisive, was responding to a call about a suspect involved in a string of petty burglaries. The description was frustratingly vague. A tall black man wearing dark clothing. Harris, already on edge from the pressure to deliver results, scanned the parking lot like a hawk. That's when he saw Elijah Carter. Standing by a sleek black sedan, Elijah was tall, well-built, and impeccably dressed in a navy suit that seemed to radiate authority. He was adjusting his tie, his phone pressed to his ear as he appeared to be deep in conversation. To Harris, Elijah fit the description well enough to warrant action. "Excuse me, sir," Harris barked, his hand instinctively resting on his holstered firearm. Elijah turned slowly, his dark eyes locking on the officer's. There was no fear in his gaze, only an unsettling calm that Harris didn't expect. "Can I help you, officer?" Elijah asked, his tone polite yet firm. "You match the description of a suspect involved in a burglary nearby. I'm going to need to see some identification," Harris said, his voice firm, betraying none of the uncertainty gnawing at him. Elijah raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "I don't believe I fit any reasonable description of a burglar. I'm an attorney, and I can assure you, you're making a grave mistake." Harris's jaw tightened. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone so composed. "Let's make this easy. Turn around, hands on the car," Harris ordered, pulling out his handcuffs. Elijah sighed, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Officer, you're profiling me based on a flimsy description and nothing more. I strongly advise you to reconsider before you embarrass yourself further." But Harris wasn't listening. His mind was made up. As he secured the cuffs around Elijah's wrists, he ignored the murmurs of onlookers gathering nearby. Elijah didn't resist, but his quiet words as he was led to the patrol car sent a chill down Harris's spine. "You're going to regret this." Harris dismissed the warning, chalking it up to bravado. He had done his job, or so he thought. The drive to the courthouse was tense. Elijah sat in the back seat, his posture impossibly upright despite the restrictive cuffs. Harris glanced at him in the rearview mirror, hoping to see some sign of fear or anger, but Elijah's face remained a mask of calm. "You don't seem nervous," Harris said, breaking the silence. "I've done nothing wrong. Why would I be?" Elijah replied, his tone measured. "But I do find it troubling that you're so convinced of my guilt based on such flimsy evidence." Harris's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "I don't make mistakes," he snapped, more to convince himself than Elijah. When they arrived at the courthouse, Harris opened the car door and guided Elijah out, keeping a firm grip on his arm. As they walked through the courthouse lobby, the murmurs began. "Another one, huh?" someone muttered. "Looks like they finally caught him," another voice chimed in. Elijah's tailored suit and polished shoes stood in stark contrast to the usual image of a criminal suspect, but the crowd seemed content to assume his guilt. Harris couldn't help but feel a flicker of doubt, but he quickly squashed it. As they neared the courtroom doors, Elijah spoke again. "You still have time to fix this. Admit you're wrong and let me go." Harris scoffed. "Not a chance." They entered the courtroom, the heavy doors creaking shut behind them. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, sat at the bench, glancing briefly at Elijah before turning her attention to Harris. "Officer Harris, what do you have for us today?" she asked, her voice neutral but expectant. Harris squared his shoulders, feeling the eyes of the courtroom on him. This was his moment to prove he had done the right thing. But as Elijah stood silently beside him, his composed presence began to unsettle Harris in a way he couldn't quite explain. It was as if Elijah knew something Harris didn't, something that would change everything. Officer Harris stepped forward confidently, clutching his report. He cleared his throat and began to present his case. "Your Honor, this individual fits the description of a suspect involved in recent burglaries in the area," Harris declared, his voice steady. "The suspect is described as a tall black man wearing dark clothing. When I encountered Mr. Carter in the parking lot, his behavior was consistent with someone avoiding detection." Elijah, standing beside Harris, showed no reaction. His face remained calm, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Amusement, perhaps? The judge frowned slightly, glancing down at her notes. And what specific actions led you to believe he was avoiding detection, Officer Harris? Harris hesitated. Well, he was standing near a vehicle, looking around and adjusting his tie, he admitted, realizing how weak it sounded. The judge raised an eyebrow. Adjusting his tie? Before Harris could respond, the judge turned her attention to Elijah. Sir, please state your name for the record. Elijah stepped forward with an air of quiet authority. He looked directly at the judge, his voice steady and calm. My name is Elijah Carter, Your Honor. I am a civil rights attorney and a partner at Whitman & Young, specializing in police accountability cases. The room went silent. The murmurs that had filled the courtroom moments ago ceased, replaced by stunned disbelief. Officer Harris's face paled. He turned toward Elijah, his confidence evaporating. What? He blurted out, unable to mask his shock. Elijah continued, ignoring Harris. Your Honor, I was detained without probable cause, based solely on an ambiguous description and the officer's bias. I have never been involved in any criminal activity, and this arrest is not only unfounded but a clear example of systemic racial profiling. The judge's gaze sharpened, shifting back to Harris. Officer, are you aware of Mr. Carter's credentials? Harris stammered, unable to form a coherent response. And no, Your Honor. I was acting on the description I was given. Elijah spoke again, his tone calm but firm. Descriptions like a tall black man in dark clothing are dangerously vague, Your Honor. They perpetuate the profiling of innocent individuals and lead to wrongful arrests like this one. It's not just about me. It's about the systemic flaws in how policing is conducted. The judge leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. This is a serious matter. Mr. Carter, you may proceed. Elijah turned to face Harris directly, his piercing gaze making the officer shift uncomfortably. Officer Harris, Elijah began, his voice measured. You claim to have followed protocol. Let's examine that. Did you have any evidence tying me to the burglaries you mentioned? Harris clenched his jaw. The description matched, and you were acting suspiciously? Suspiciously? Elijah interrupted, his voice rising slightly but never losing its control. Standing in a parking lot while wearing a suit and adjusting my tie? That's your justification? Harris's face reddened. I was doing my job. No, Elijah shot back, his tone icy. You weren't doing your job. You were operating on assumptions rooted in bias. Would you have detained a white man in a suit under the same circumstances? The question hung in the air, heavy and damning. Harris opened his mouth to respond but faltered, unable to provide a satisfactory answer. Elijah turned back to the judge. Your Honor, this is not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger problem. How many more innocent people will be subjected to this kind of treatment? How many lives will be disrupted because of lazy, biased policing? The judge's expression remained stern, but there was a flicker of understanding in her eyes. Elijah continued, his voice growing more passionate. This isn't just about me. It's about the countless men and women who don't have the resources or the platform to fight back. They are silenced, humiliated, and left to bear the consequences of a system that refuses to hold itself accountable. The tension in the room was palpable. Harris's earlier bravado had crumbled, replaced by visible discomfort. He looked to the judge for support but found none. The judge finally spoke, her voice firm. Officer Harris, you will have an opportunity to defend your actions. But for now, I'd like to hear more from Mr. Carter. His points are compelling and require thorough examination. Elijah nodded, stepping back slightly but never breaking eye contact with Harris. This is about more than me, Officer Harris. It's about what your actions represent and the harm they cause. The courtroom remained silent, every eye fixed on the unfolding drama. Harris's world was beginning to unravel, and Elijah was just getting started. Elijah took a deep breath, steadying himself before addressing the court again. The room was silent, the weight of his words demanding attention. Your Honor, he began, turning to face the judge directly. This is not just about me. It's about a system that allows vague descriptions to justify harassment and wrongful arrests. It's about the unchecked authority given to officers who act on bias rather than evidence. Elijah paused, letting his words sink in. The audience, which had initially been skeptical of him, now seemed captivated by his calm but powerful demeanor. "Consider this," Elijah continued, pacing slightly as he spoke. "If the description had been more specific, perhaps including distinguishing features, clothing details, or a timeline, this officer might have realized I didn't match the profile. Instead, he relied on a lazy, generalized assumption. A tall black man. And that assumption was enough to deprive me of my freedom, even temporarily." Officer Harris shifted uncomfortably, his face reddening under the weight of Elijah's accusations. Elijah turned to the audience, addressing them as much as the court. "Imagine how many others have been wrongfully detained because they happen to fit these vague, stereotypical descriptions. Imagine the fear, the humiliation, and the frustration of being treated as a suspect simply because of the color of your skin." He gestured toward the judge. "Your Honor, this is not a new issue. It's a systemic problem that demands accountability. And that accountability must start here, today, in this courtroom." The judge regarded Elijah with a thoughtful expression, clearly weighing the gravity of his words. The murmurs in the audience began again, this time tinged with agreement and admiration. The judge turned her attention to Officer Harris, her gaze piercing. "Officer, you've heard Mr. Carter's concerns. How do you respond to the claim that your actions were based on bias rather than evidence?" Harris cleared his throat, struggling to maintain his composure. "Your Honor, I was following standard procedure. The description I received was vague, yes, but I acted in good faith to protect the public." Elijah folded his arms, his expression unreadable. The judge nodded but pressed further. "Good faith does not excuse poor judgment, officer. What specific evidence led you to believe Mr. Carter was the suspect?" Harris hesitated. He fit the description, and his behavior was unusual. Elijah couldn't remain silent. "Unusual?" he interjected, his tone sharp. "What was unusual about standing by my car and adjusting my tie? Or does professionalism itself become suspicious when it's displayed by someone who looks like me?" The judge raised her hand to maintain order. "Mr. Carter, you'll have your turn again." "Officer Harris, continue." Harris shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't mean it like that. I was trying to do my job. I wasn't profiling him." Elijah cut in again, this time addressing the court. "That's exactly what profiling is, Officer Harris. It's making assumptions about someone's guilt based on their appearance, not their actions. And it's a pervasive issue in policing." The judge leaned forward, her expression serious. "Officer Harris, are you familiar with the concept of implicit bias?" Harris frowned. "I've heard of it, Your Honor, but I don't believe it applies here. I was acting on the information provided to me." The judge sighed, clearly unimpressed by his answer. Implicit bias refers to the unconscious stereotypes that influence decisions and actions, often without the individual's awareness. Your behavior today raises concerns about whether such biases influenced your actions. Harris opened his mouth to protest, but the judge raised a hand to silence him. "This court will not tolerate decisions made on assumptions rather than facts, officer. You'll have an opportunity to defend yourself further, but I advise you to consider the implications of your actions carefully." Elijah stepped forward once more. "Your Honor, bias training isn't enough. It's a step in the right direction, but real change requires a shift in culture. A culture that values evidence over assumptions and justice over convenience." The judge nodded, her gaze still fixed on Harris. "Noted, Mr. Carter. Officer Harris, we will continue this discussion shortly." The tension in the room was electric, and Harris's earlier confidence was now visibly shaken. Elijah had not only exposed the officer's actions, but had also drawn attention to the broader systemic issues that allowed them to occur. The courtroom had become a battleground for justice, and Elijah was determined to see it through. The courtroom was tense as the judge leaned forward, her fingers steepled, signaling that she had reached her verdict. The room was silent, save for the faint shuffle of papers and the occasional creak of the wooden benches. "Officer Harris," the judge began, her voice steady but tinged with authority. "This court finds your justification for the arrest insufficient and deeply concerning. Your reliance on vague descriptions, coupled with an apparent lack of critical judgment, demonstrates a failure in professional responsibility. Harris stood rigid, his hands clasped tightly at his sides. The judge's words cut through his earlier confidence like a blade. While I understand the challenges of law enforcement, the judge continued, those challenges do not excuse poor decision-making or biased practices. This court demands higher standards, especially when the consequences of such actions can cause harm to innocent individuals and erode public trust. Elijah stood still, his expression neutral but his eyes keenly focused on the proceedings. The judge turned her attention to him. Mr. Carter, your composure and clarity in presenting your case are commendable. You've highlighted issues that this court cannot ignore. She shifted her gaze back to Harris. Officer Harris, I am ordering the following. You will complete mandatory bias training within 30 days, submit a written apology to Mr. Carter, and participate in a departmental review of arrest protocols to ensure such mistakes do not happen again. Furthermore, this court will recommend an internal investigation into your conduct during this incident. Harris's face flushed with a mix of shame and frustration. Your Honor, The judge raised her hand to silence him. That is my ruling, officer. Consider this a chance to reflect on your actions and the broader implications of your role in law enforcement. The gavel struck the wooden block, punctuating the decision with finality. Harris glanced at Elijah, his eyes filled with reluctant acknowledgement. Slowly, he stepped back and nodded toward the judge before returning to his seat. Elijah took a deep breath as the judge turned to him. Mr. Carter, you've been granted the floor if you have any final remarks. He nodded and stepped forward, his posture straight and commanding. He scanned the room, meeting the eyes of the judge, Harris, and the murmuring audience. Your Honor, I appreciate the court's decision and its efforts to hold individuals accountable, he began. But accountability cannot end here. This is not just about Officer Harris. It's about a system that perpetuates these behaviors. If we don't address the root cause, we will continue to see these injustices unfold. Elijah's voice grew more passionate, resonating with everyone in the room. I am not here seeking personal vindication. I am here to demand systemic change. This courtroom represents the principles of fairness and justice, and yet, outside these walls, countless individuals are subjected to unfair treatment every single day. He turned to Harris, his tone softening slightly but remaining firm. Officer Harris, I accept your apology, if it is genuine. But apologies alone do not solve this problem. I urge you to use this experience to advocate for better training, fair practices, and a deeper understanding of the communities you serve. Harris lowered his head, seemingly taking in the weight of Elijah's words. Elijah then addressed the audience, his voice filled with resolve. Each of us has a responsibility to challenge our biases, to speak up when we see injustice, and to demand better from the systems that govern us. Change is not easy, but it is necessary. He paused, letting the gravity of his words settle. This case is one small step toward accountability, but it is not the end. It is a reminder that justice is not a destination. It is a journey, one that requires vigilance, courage, and unwavering commitment from all of us. The courtroom erupted in subdued applause, a rare display of unity and support. The judge gave a nod of approval, and Elijah stepped back, his calm demeanor returning. As the proceedings concluded and people began to file out of the room, Elijah stood quietly for a moment, watching the ripples of change he hoped to inspire. He knew this victory was just the beginning, but it was a start, a necessary step toward a fairer future. As Elijah stepped outside the courthouse, the warm afternoon sun hit his face. A small crowd had gathered, consisting of curious onlookers, reporters, and a few supporters who had heard about the case. Conversations buzzed around him, but his focus was elsewhere. He took a moment to breathe in the fresh air, letting the tension of the courtroom dissolve. Among the crowd, a woman approached cautiously. She appeared to be in her late 50s, her gray-streaked hair pulled back into a neat bun. Her eyes, brimming with emotion, met Elijah's. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice trembling, "I just wanted to thank you. My son was arrested last year under similar circumstances. He's still fighting to clear his name. What you did today, it gives people like us hope." Elijah offered her a kind smile, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you for sharing that with me. And tell your son to keep fighting. Change is slow, but it's possible. As the woman walked away, Elijah noticed more people nodding respectfully in his direction. Some murmured quiet thanks, others simply stood in silent solidarity. It was a stark contrast to the skepticism and judgment he had faced earlier in the day. Reporters closed in, microphones and cameras aimed directly at him. One stepped forward. "Mr. Carter, can you share your thoughts on today's ruling? Do you consider it a victory?" Elijah straightened his tie, his calm demeanor unwavering. Today's decision was a step in the right direction, but it's far from the solution. Accountability for one officer does not fix a broken system. This case highlights the need for widespread reform, and that's where our focus should be. The cameras flashed, capturing his measured expression. Another reporter chimed in. "What's your message to those who feel disheartened by the slow pace of change?" Elijah met the reporter's gaze, his voice steady. "My message is simple. Don't give up. Every voice, every action, every step matters. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with moments like this, when we refuse to accept injustice as the norm." With that, Elijah excused himself from the crowd, walking toward his car. He reflected on the day's events, knowing that while this small victory was important, it was only one battle in a much larger fight. Later that evening, Elijah found himself sitting in his modest but well-kept apartment. The room was quiet except for the hum of his phone as notifications poured in, messages of support, invitations for interviews, and even a few threats. He sighed, understanding the weight of what had transpired and what lay ahead. He turned on his laptop and logged into a live streaming platform. His inbox had been flooded with requests for a statement, and Elijah decided it was time to address the public directly. The screen lit up, showing his face. He adjusted the camera and began speaking, his voice calm but resolute. "Good evening, everyone. My name is Elijah Carter, and earlier today, I stood in a courtroom not as a prosecutor, but as a victim of wrongful arrest. What happened to me was not an isolated incident. It's a reflection of the systemic flaws that exist within our justice system." He leaned closer, his tone growing more impassioned. "For too long, we've allowed biases to dictate who is seen as innocent and who is presumed guilty. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who has been unfairly targeted, harassed, or silenced because of their race, their appearance, or their background." The viewer count climbed rapidly as more people tuned in. Elijah's words resonated deeply. We cannot rely solely on the courts or the government to fix these issues. Real change begins with us. It starts with questioning our own biases, speaking up when we see injustice, and holding those in power accountable. Justice isn't just a legal concept, it's a moral obligation. He paused, allowing his words to settle. Today was a step forward, but it's not enough. I'm calling on all of you to join this fight, not just for me, but for the countless others who don't have the platform to be heard. Together, we can create a system that values fairness over prejudice and humanity over power. Elijah ended the stream with a quiet but powerful statement. Justice is a choice we make every day. Let's choose it. As he closed his laptop, Elijah leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew he wasn't alone. The events of the day had sparked a conversation, a ripple that, with enough effort, could become a wave of change. For Elijah, this was more than a personal victory. It was a call to action, a reminder that even the smallest steps toward justice could lead to a better future. Elijah sat quietly in his apartment, reflecting on the journey that had led him to this moment. What had started as a wrongful arrest had blossomed into something far greater. A chance to amplify voices that had long been silenced, a chance to challenge a system that had perpetuated injustice for far too long. He knew that the fight for true justice wasn't one that could be won in a day or a week. But he also understood that the power of a single action, one act of standing up, one moment of speaking out, could echo for years to come, sparking conversations, igniting change, and inspiring others to rise as well. As the night drew on, Elijah made a quiet promise to himself. He would continue this fight, not just for himself, but for the countless others whose names were never heard, whose stories were never told. He would not stop until the system had been reshaped, until fairness and dignity were afforded to all, regardless of race or background. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, But Elijah had already taken the most important step. He had chosen to act, to be a voice in the silence, to turn the tide toward justice. And he knew, with unwavering certainty, that he was not alone. There were many others who would walk alongside him, united in the pursuit of a more just world. And in that shared resolve, there was hope. Thank you so much for listening to Elijah's story until the very end. This journey is not just a personal one, but a call to action for all of us to reflect and act toward creating a more just society. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any future videos. Share this video with your friends and family to spread the message of justice and change. Thank you again for joining us on this journey.